going to share some of the observations on challenges and required enablers to decarbonize the sector. Second, we have some specific examples on sustainable finance deals that Eric will go over. And then third, we are really excited to share with everybody the specific framework that we recently launched that allows banks to measure and disclose the emissions intensity of their steel lending portfolios, and which can be used to support the low carbon transition of the sector.
If you think about what I've just said, that customers are interested in this, there's an interdependency, in the supply chain. You also see, of course, the supply chain changing because, for instance, if you're going to go for the hydrogen route, you are probably going to want to talk to suppliers of electricity rather than suppliers of coking coal as you do now. So there's a switch there. And the downstream companies are trying to get their hands on the green steel and are also willing to make certain investments or commitments to actually get there. And I think that's very important because when we're talking about financing, for instance, and again, the question that's constantly being asked, how can we get more financing to go, is we need solid business cases to be done for these kind of projects. So that means that you do need to have the electricity supply in place. That does mean that you need to have offtake contracts in place, and therefore off-takers that are willing to commit to certain volumes for a longer period of time, which is quite unusual within the steel sector. But we've seen this development, and I think that's very, very encouraging because it will take part, or it will solve part of the financing issue that is there. And then I'm not talking about the debt part because it does, these kind of partnerships facilitate, I think, the debt part. But what you also see is that on the equity side, obviously, there need to be investments, and I think by doing these kind of partnerships, especially the equity part can really be solved. You see that, for instance, the Gravity project, which is going to be in France. It's a green iron project, so it's not a steel project per se, but that works kind of towards the potential split in the iron making and the steel making in Europe, which is a bit of a threat for the incumbents because geography is a large driver of the competitiveness of hydrogen-based iron, and you can imagine that definitely at this point in time, there are a lot of places in Europe where it's not a great idea to make hydrogen-based iron, including probably Central Europe. So players like this who can be a little bit more nimble, maybe have lower electricity inputs. H2GS also has a project together with Iberdrola in Spain scheduled to focus on that. So that could be both opportunities within the supply chain and threats for the incumbents. Parties being creative in setting this up. H2GS, of course, recently was in the news with their project financing, which again was facilitated by long-term offtake contracts. SSAB Hybrid is a prime example of different players within the supply chain teaming up and creating something stronger to enable the green steel project. And Salzgitter is trying to do the same with BMW, and actually also they have a partnership with Ørsted that I mentioned before. Because again, Ørsted wants to have green steel, and Salzgitter will need green electricity. So the one hand washes the other very much in terms of partnership and collaboration in the value chain.
Our work at the Center for Climate Aligned Finance at RMI really is positioned around how we can support the low carbon and 1.5 aligned transition across the financial sector. So one of the things that we are positioned to do and are quite committed to work on is supporting these financial institutions in setting commitments and then implementing against their net zero targets. So, Eric obviously just walked through all the companies that are beginning to pursue means to finance low carbon projects and emissions reduction. We're also witnessing the increase of ambition being raised across the financial sector to tackle climate change. And I think this is most commonly materialized in the number of banks that have joined GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which requires a net zero commitment. Since April of last year, participation has tripled, and now there's over 550 financial institutions that are committing to transition the global economy to net zero GHGs. As part of this, one of the initiatives under GFANZ is the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And as part of this, again, banks commit to set sector level targets for carbon intensive sectors, including steel. So now we're seeing 40% or so of global banking assets included under these net zero commitments. And as part of that, it's not just about target setting, but it's also, of course, about implementation. And how these banks can steer their portfolios in line with climate targets. This will require benchmarking progress, it'll require engaging clients, and it'll require the mobilization of a huge amount of capital to facilitate the decarbonization of the real economy.
Harman Autodome, thank you very much for this talk. I've read it twice and now I heard it and now I start to understand what you're actually done, and it's actually quite brilliant, I think. You talked about everybody's got their own method, and now I heard recently that France is developed a calculation method to allocate part of the emissions to the slag, because slag from the steel industry reduces CO2 emissions massively in the cement industry. Have you covered that loophole or creativity or realistic calculation method? Or will you do that maybe in the future?
So I will just say we had talked about this quite a bit in terms of if emissions should be off, if you can offset emissions from steel production for the use in slag. And what we had decided is that it doesn't change anything more systemically in terms of the practices of the steel industry. It's almost just a result of their steel production. And so we decided, we made a concerted effort or concerted decision not to include that as part of the methodology. And I think what I'm seeing from several other initiatives out there is a similar decision not to credit steel producers for this. But that's an important note, and that's something that I think we should certainly look into, is how France is treating the allocation of those emissions.
My name is Binay, I'm from IBM. So a little bit of nuanced question on a carbon footprint. So hydrogen or major carbon sequestration is very clear. What if some plants would like to do a progressive carbon footprint reduction in terms of improved asset management or recycling of their refractories or something like that? Can such initiatives also be financed?
Yeah, for sure. I wouldn't see why not. I mean, I think a lot of the short-term gains are in any case in incremental and energy efficiency kind of measures. And those are very, very important. I think by estimates are that you can reduce carbon emissions by up to 30 to 40%, depending where you start, simply by implementing those kind of efficiencies. So I think definitely in emerging markets, right, where you're not just working with best available technologies just yet, there's tremendous scope for those kind of projects.
And just to add to that, Binay, thank you for your question. The Sustainable Steel Principles in particular does not dictate or require how finance is being allocated. That's up to each individual bank. So I just wanted to note there's nothing within the Sustainable Steel Principles that says what technology or what projects can and cannot receive capital.
Yeah, my name is Martin van der Hemel from Exxon International. Good to hear, Eric, especially that the former question that you want to finance people who want to be proactive. But I think you like to encourage the transition. I think it's very good that you lead the banks this way. But what if, in the end, some clients are unwilling to decarbonize?
Yeah, well, that's it's an interesting question, right? I mean, so this is, I think what's important to realize that is not a short-term kind of question, right? I mean, we do need to be conscious of the constraints that are there. We do need to be realistic, and we do need to realize that, there's only so much companies can do. So today we're in 2022, and we're setting out these kind of, banks are really starting to set out these commitments. They're starting to set out their reporting. But I do think, pressure on that will continue to increase. And of course, as banks start to increasingly engage with their clients, as the 20s come to an end, there's questions on, if you have not done anything by then, whether you're still the right kind of client to be lending to. And this is not just, and I do think that's very important to realize, right? That this is not just a sustainability question or a question about a bank trying to look good. I mean, to me, and I said that before, steel is an industry where sustainability is absolute core to corporate strategy.